Welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. I'm your host, Killian, journalism director at think-liberty.com. Make sure to visit the site, check the little bell at the corner to make sure that you get all of the daily updates from the site. I listen to this podcast and the other ones on the Think Liberty Podcast Network, pretty much anywhere that you get your podcasts. And you can check out our shop for limited edition t-shirts that we have on special, $15 instead of $20. Tons of great content always there. So, for today's episode, I'm going to dive right in here. I wanted to discuss moral philosophy. I always go with these softball topics, don't I? So, when we're talking about moral philosophy, there's a couple things that need to be covered that are important. I'm going to break the episode into 3 distinct categories just to keep ideas nice and tight, as it were. The first is the sources of moral philosophy. So, where do we get our morals from? The middle portion I'm going to devote to the theories that I have in relation to libertarianism. And the third portion will be on the application side, so on the actual practical application of different moral theory. So to start off, let's look at what moral philosophy is. So moral philosophy is in effect ethics. It's the concept of ethics. Now, when we're discussing ethics, it breaks into 3 primary subcategories. We have meta-ethics, which is more the theoretical side. We have normative ethics, which regards the practical side. And we have applied ethics, which is situation-specific. So I guess the best way to break this down would be meta-ethics would be something along the lines of asking, can there be a purely morally just action? Whereas normative ethics would be something as, is this general act right or wrong? Then you have applied ethics, which is, here is this specific situation with this specific list of conditions that define the total scenario. So it's not like normative ethics where you have a generalized approach. It's, here's the name, here's the dates, here's the people involved, here's every step that took place, here's everyone's perspective on it. All of these angles considered. Is this morally just, or is there a right or a wrong answer to this? So I want to start with the sourcing of moral philosophy or of ethics. Now, there's a lot of theories about where we get our ethical notions from. Some would say it comes purely from reason, just because of philosophical banter back and forth, and historically that's been where a lot of our knowledge of philosophy has come from, or especially in regards to ethics. There's the very common understanding of natural moral philosophy, or natural rights, natural law, which usually involves either the idea of God-granted or creator-granted rights, or it involves the idea of the natural state of human beings. So it's more along the lines that we discover what is morally correct versus deciding what is morally correct through discourse. Then you have other models such as the Hayek model, which is evolutionary morality, which is to say social norms that evolved over time as societies and cultures and have developed and changed and decided what the rules of interaction should be because they're the most beneficial to society at the time as per what they see as the future of their society. Now, I would say that there's certain validity in each one of these depending on where you're applying it. So, for example, you could be applying natural rights into the concept of normative ethics, in which case the basic concepts of life, liberty, property make tons of sense. It's something that fits very well just globally. It's not purely a Western idea. It's something that most cultures agree on to some degree everywhere around the world, though in their own interpretations. Once you get into applied ethics, which is where, again, you get into those specifics, those particular situations of when is this right, when is this wrong, when is this allowed, when is this not allowed. As far as the theoretical side is concerned, when we're talking about the more grandiose questions, I would find that the Hayekian model is which is the evolutionary model, which seems to make the most sense when we're trying to understand where our morality and by extension our rights come from. Because when we're talking about rights, which I'm sure everyone has had a conversation about what is a right, what isn't a right, we have these conversations based on the ethical backgrounds to it. We never discuss rights just as rights in and of themselves. It's the ethics behind it. So, saying that a person has a series of rights for whichever reason that you come up with or whichever school of rights that you subscribe to, we come to these conclusions based on the ethical background that we have. So, for example, if we consider the pure individual freedom and liberty of a human being to be the utmost importance, then of course we're going to fall into a belief in certain sets of rights that most respect that, including, say, under natural rights, you have the concept of negative rights and positive rights, or the concept of basically you have the inherent rights and you have the state-granted rights, which are additional rights, hence positive rights. The idea that you would even allow the concept of state-granted right, or that you have a backbone that there's inherent individual rights to a human being, is going to be tied into your ethical code. It's going to be tied into your moral philosophy. Now, on this front, I find, and I know there's a lot of you out there that are going to disagree with me on this, I find that the natural moral philosophy argument starts to falter in this theoretical stage, right at the base point. Because in order for you to say that natural rights are going to be, or natural moral philosophy even, is going to be correct, is going to be what best applies to all people everywhere, that is implying a certain level of objectivity when it comes to morality. Now, we see a lot of the arguments back and forth of objective morality versus subjective morality. I personally lean towards the subjective morality side. Now, a lot of people will take this, argument ad absurdum and go into the full, oh, well, that means if someone thinks that it's okay to, kill somebody because they felt like it, then all of a sudden it's okay to kill people because you feel like it. That's not the concept of subjective morality. That misses the point of it entirely. It's in the application phase that we see the subjectivity. Because let's say, I'll use a basic example. I was in a pretty interesting conversation about this today, actually, where this concept came up. Let's say, for example, you find out that a man cheated on his wife. Now, you would say to yourself right off the bat, that's morally wrong. That's the take that you would have. This is morally wrong. Now, let's say that's just the normative question at that point. And you can say, I objectively believe that this is morally wrong because of the commitment that was made, because of various standards that you personally might hold. But what if I tell you that the wife was in a coma? She'd been there for 15 years. He'd been strong for the first 5, but he couldn't let her go. He cares for her too much, loves her too much, cannot let that marriage end. He's not going to divorce her, he's not going to pull the plug, but he's only human. Now, some of you might say that objectively he's still in the wrong for cheating on his wife in this case. Other ones might say, it's morally acceptable. It's morally acceptable that he went ahead and did this, rather than, say, pulling the plug and losing his wife. Others might say that he was morally justified in doing so because the only reason that she's still alive is because he's, paid to keep her on life support in order to keep her alive in case she comes back from her coma. But in the same sense, he's still only human, and can you really judge him solely for being human? That's when you get from the normative stage into the application stage when we're talking about moral philosophy. Going back to the meta side, the meta-ethics of it, you have to understand here that you could say there's an objective answer, but where is your objective answer coming from? Well, your objective answer is coming from what you've reached as your findings of morality. It's not coming from one source that is undeniable. It's coming from your experiences, your understanding, the way that you interpret moral teachings that you've received throughout your life. If you try to trace it back to an origin point, any type of moral code, you will find that it traces back to either an individual or a group of individuals that chose to believe in a certain form of moral philosophy. You can say 2 + 2 = 4 as much as you want, but it doesn't change that your morality at its core is going to be based on your subjective experience. You cannot lay claim to saying there's an objective truth here and someone else is just wrong because they disagree with what I think is the morally objective truth. Because when we get back to the sources of our moral truths, they all come from our own objective experience. Moving into the next step here, we're going to go into how this applies to libertarian thought process. I'm not going to spend too much time on here, simply because most of you have probably debated libertarian ideology to its practical death at this point. So I'm not going to bore you with the baseline ideas or different things that you've come across that led you to either believing in libertarian ideology or something close to it, or something that would bring you close enough to be able to hear this podcast at the very least. When we look at the foundations of moral philosophy in libertarianism, primarily it's based around two main ideas. The first being the idea of natural rights, which seems to be a driving force for many followers of libertarian philosophy. And the second is the concept of the individual. So I already covered natural morality and things like that a little earlier, and I will touch on it again later. But I want to focus in right now on the concept of individual liberty. So going back, as I explained, when we're trying to deal with ethical codes, rights, everything else like that, it comes down to what we as individuals see as the most correct answer, as close to one as we can get. Working from this perspective, we see that libertarians or liberty-minded people put the focus on the individual, that the liberty of an individual is of the utmost importance. And I think that's why you'll find a lot of libertarians that subscribe to Stoicism. They subscribe to, again, natural rights, natural law. They subscribe to any and all types of moral directive that is symbiotic with the notion of individual rights and of the freedom of the individual. Now, that isn't to say that libertarians are hedonistic by saying that they, by claiming that they want only what is good for them, themselves as an individual, and all they care about is the pleasure of the person or anything like that. That's a bit of a misnomer when we're talking about specific philosophical schools. It's a matter of the freedom of the individual to act as they wish, as they should have complete moral agency over themselves. Now, when we touch on the concept of moral agency, that implies that an individual has the ability to react to situations or to comprehend situations through a moral lens and act independently on that. So, for example, a 3-year-old couldn't be considered a moral agent because they don't have a defined ideology of morality. An animal couldn't be considered a moral agent because they don't have that understanding of morality in the same sense that humans do, or at least that developed humans do. What's interesting with the notion of moral agency, and again this ties back to my beliefs on the subjectivity side, is that it's through this moral agency and through our interactions with each other as individuals that we create these collective standards that we work by. It's a very ironic kind of thing where we push so hard for the individual that the result is a society of individuals that believe in a concept of rights and believe in the concepts of liberty, of property, of all of these other things, and it's held together by our collective existence. It's not held up by each individual person just willing this morality on everyone else around them. It's brought upon through cooperation. It's brought upon through the formation of what we would consider society. Because a lot of people forget this. Society isn't some big boogeyman thing or some entity. It's literally just a series of people that happen to be together in a certain geological area, that happen to subscribe to a certain culture, certain views of the world, etc., etc. Even as vastly different as some of the views inside that group can be. Now, when we put the libertarian lens to this, we end up asking ourselves, well, if everything's based on the collective interaction of human beings here, there, and everywhere, but we're basing our concept of individual liberty on notions such as natural rights that we get from Plato, from Thomas Paine, to a much lesser degree from Thomas Hobbes, as much as anyone in the libertarian movement absolutely despises hearing that name out loud. And we subscribe its sourcing to something else. Some people in the libertarian movement will subscribe it to a creator and go through the natural rights route. Other ones will go full constitutionalist and lay claim that the rights come from the enforcement of the Constitution or whichever government document happens to enforce your rights in a certain country. Or they'll try to go the objectivist route and say that this concept of individual liberty has been the truth of all time. It's just taken us this long to discover it. It's taken this long for us to come to these answers, which were the correct answers all along. It turns out that we answered these moral questions, and we just happen to do so in our current time, in our current location on the planet, and it just so happened to match our worldview as seen in our culture, in our area, in our time with our group of people. When we take a look at that sourcing, that idea, that justification for what we're trying to build our society on, what we're trying to govern ourselves, and what we're trying to relay to each other as the correct courses of action in all things, I personally find it to be very faulty footing. It's hard to say that all of these concepts come from some sort of objective source that we can't actually back up as an objective source outside of our own emotionally charged subjective reasoning. I think that the liberty movement in general would do far better if we dropped the idea of being these, quasi-emotionless, here are the facts, here's the logic, here's why we're right, here's the straight-up debate of everything, and switched it into more of a gear of understanding. I mean, the amount of libertarians out there that they believe that individual liberty is an objective truth, and if you disagree with it or you want to impede with it, you're some kind of evil statist, and you need to be sent off to a gulag or dropped out of a helicopter or something inane like that. These positions do nothing for us on the moral side, because for a moral ideology to be accepted and for it to be implemented, so for us to have a form of normative ethics that relates to the ethics we subscribe to, that involves getting people on our side. That involves changing minds. That involves changing hearts. That involves getting people to change their worldview, to accept the way that we see things, not through our political lens or through our economic lens, but also through our moral lens. This is something that those on the left in general have understood for years, that they take these emotional concepts, but they fight for them through a lens of logic. We may not agree with where the logic goes, and we may find that more often than not it's more emotional pleas than it is logical pleas, but when we're discussing morality, when we're discussing this social construct that we have of how to govern ourselves and what are just actions, what we mean when we say an action can be just in that sense, we need to include the subjectivity of the person. We need to include the emotional side of the moral agents at play, because their morality is going to be shaped by their subjective experience. And one of the most impactful aspects of our subjective experiences in the world is the emotional side. Now, if we're talking about putting our moral philosophy into motion, so in this case we're talking about putting it into a conversation so that we can try to get more people to understand, appreciate where our moral philosophy is coming from, and hopefully subscribe to our moral philosophy, we also need to look at how our moral philosophy applies in day-to-day life, in real-life situations. So this is the third branch of ethics as a school of philosophy, which is the applied ethics. Now again, we've covered normative, and it's a pretty close concept because normative is the more generalized how-tos or what-abouts, whereas applied is in specific situations. So the easiest example of applied ethics would be something like medical ethics or scientific ethics, business ethics, where you have very specific situations that take place and you need to look at them through an ethical lens based on what you believe would be the most ethically correct choice of action. What's interesting with the applied side of moral philosophy is that you end up having less of a focus on things like rights or things such as the origin of morality or anything like that, but more you end up with questions like, do ends justify means? You end up with theories of consequentialists. For example, they believe that the good of an action can be judged by its outcome. You look at utilitarians, and they base things on the total good for everyone involved, and that's what becomes a morally just action, and that becomes the lens that they use for working through the morals of a situation. In libertarianism, there's the non-aggression principle that we work off of, while other political philosophies would use a different type of lens than we do for deciding whether or not something is morally just, morally acceptable, or just generally abhorrent as a course of action. Now, one thing that's very interesting when we're talking about the application of moral philosophy of ethics, by extension of rights, it's when we see these things come into conflict with each other. A great example would be the big hullabaloo about a month ago or so with Alex Jones getting booted off of a whole bunch of social media. It was interesting because there was the freedom of association that came into play, the freedom of speech arguments that were coming up, the private property rights idea that came into play as well, and it created this whole hubbubaloo where people weren't quite sure where they stood, because very rarely do they try to put different moral notions that they may hold against each other to see what kind of hierarchy they would form, to see which concepts of their moral philosophy they find to be more important, or if there's any situations where they could contrast with each other and end up creating a even more negative situation because they're believing in things that will eventually collide, and there's no clear answer when these separate moral concepts collide. I'll close off with a little bit of a theory that some of you can chew on for a bit. Let us know again in the comments on any of the social media feeds you follow us on that you happen to see this posted to. Take, for example, the concept of natural rights, coming from the moral ethics of we're all endowed with a certain set of natural rights, what natural behaviors, things that are morally correct based on who and what we are as a species. So when we go to the rights aspect of natural law and natural rights, part of natural rights is a right to property. we see the distinction usually get made of positive rights, negative rights, where usually the positive rights is in relation to rights granted by the government, whereas the negative rights are the ones that are inherent to you. But the positive rights aspect can also mean rights granted to you by the community, by society, by the group of individuals that have agreed that this is something that we're going to consider a right for the people that are here together with each other. Quite often you'll see the argument from the left that this means that healthcare can be a right so long as enough people agree on it. Now, again, I would probably consider myself closer to the Hayek's view of evolutionary morality, in which case, yes, if a whole bunch of people got together and society at large decided that this is something we're going to consider to be a right, then, well, that would probably end up being a right, whether you really agree with it or not, because there's a moral consensus on what is and is not the rights of the individuals. Now, positive rights are always a little bit interesting here, because we talk about government-granted rights and sanctions. Let's talk about private property. Now, many consider private property to be a solely positive right, which is to say that private property is enforced solely through the force of government to back this up. Now, obviously, there's 1,001 different sub-schools of anarchy that have quite a bit of disagreement with that. Now, I'm going to avoid going into all the arguments about how private property could exist or how property rights could exist or, the occupancy and use system or any of that stuff. I'm going to ignore all of that and go at it from the perspective of natural rights. Under natural rights, you have a right to property. So that means you have the right to go out, you can homestead property, or if you've, mixed your labor with the land, you can, at that point, own the land, trade land, all the sort of stuff that we consider norms inside of a capitalistic system. Now, when we reach a point where there's no more land left, what happens to your rights to property? Eventually, as the population continues to increase, we're going to reach a point where there isn't any land left to homestead. There's no land left to simply take or to set out your own territory, as was the idea when we first heard this notion of rights to life, liberty, and property back in, ancient Greece or back in the time of Thomas Paine when there was tons of land to go around. Take a look at any major inner city. Would you say that a homeless person there has a right to property? No, because they don't have the funds for it. They don't have the access to those types of markets in order to have land. In fact, in the case of homeless, they can't even rent the concept of property. And yet, we say that people have a right to it. Well, how can you have a right to something that you can't access? So, when we look at private property is inherently exclusive. If you own property, then you're the one that owns property. You're the one that decides whether or not people can go there. And under the concept of natural rights and natural law, then that means that you are able to hold that property because you have a right to having that property, and you can keep people out from your property. When we look at the other people who have a right to have property, but there's no property left to have, the only solution at that point is to say, well, what does this mean? How can we have a right to property and there be no property for us to have a right to? How does this work? And the honest answer is that it doesn't. The natural rights theory of property ownership does not work if we're going to take on a private property system. Now, I personally believe that a private property system works best for society overall, as seen with the massive expanse that we've had in the West most notably, but also in other places around the world that have started to catch on since we've implemented capitalism and the private property structure of ownership. But again, if we're trying to consider it a right, if we're turning it into a morals question, into an ethics question, into a concept of social constructs at this point, how can we have a right to something that we don't have access to? And the honest answer is that we don't. If you listen to the podcast on Tuesday, there was one that came up there, the warrant problem, which is the warrant problem was the idea that how do you have a system where you can implement warrants in order to, arrest criminals or in order to investigate someone's property if you want to avoid violating their rights? And if you subscribed to the natural rights belief, then frankly the answer is you can't. It's the same thing with property ownership. You can't have a singular set of rights to property and have exclusive property. It's kind of it's a catch-22 with this one. You can't have it where you have a right to something that by the default of its own existence, by its own material existence, means that not every human can have a right to it. And you're going to try to call it a natural right that all humans share. When these rights or these moral ideologies clash, that's when we find where our faults are in our own moral philosophy. When we're trying to figure out what we got right, what we got wrong, what we can change. And this is the part that nobody wants to do. Nobody wants to say that their own morals need to change, but this is the part where we need to address these clashes that we see in our own moral theory. Because I can name, 100 different schools of moral philosophy that you may or may not subscribe to, same as different political ideologies. But at the end of the day, the moral philosophy that matters is your own personal moral code. We're not going to come up with a definitive answer for what is the morally just action for every single possible scenario, but the importance of moral philosophy, discussing it, understanding it, and being willing to take different approaches is so that every time we discuss it and every time an ethical or moral question arises, we can be better suited to come up with a more beneficial and more just course of action. So I'm going to close everything off here, and hopefully you enjoyed the episode. If you do have any questions or comments, then by all means feel free to contact us with your questions or arguments or counter-arguments that you might have. Again, visit our website. You can find other articles on other topics like this. We have different content that comes out daily. Hit the little bell, subscribe to get the notifications for the daily updates. Even if you're not a fan of notifications, it's worth it. Trust me. And again, if you enjoyed everything that you heard and you enjoy listening to me talk about different philosophical concepts or different off-topic ideas that might arise, then I will see you next week.